Honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Vazrik Chiloyan, and on behalf of the Armenian National Committee of Eastern Massachusetts, I welcome you all. We are delighted to host Dr. Michael Rubin, a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute this evening. As you are all well aware, for 2 months, the 120,000 Armenians of the Republic of Artsakh, including 30,000 children, have been under blockade, with the situation deteriorating on a daily basis. Nonetheless, the people of Artsakh have demonstrated incredible resolve to stay in their ancestral homeland. The government of Azerbaijan, deploying so-called eco-activists, has blocked the sole transportation and supply route from Armenia to Artsakh, cutting off the daily supply of food, medicine, electricity, and fuel. Azerbaijan is using these unlawful tactics towards its goal of ethnic cleansing of Artsakh of its native Armenian population and subsequent annexation of the territories to Azerbaijan proper. Meanwhile, Russian peacekeepers tasked with patrolling the transport and supply route to Armenia have been unable to intervene effectively to stop the Azeri blockade and restore access to and from Artsakh. The Lemkin Institute for Genocide Prevention has issued red flag alerts and the following statement in response to the Lachin Corridor blockade. Quote, Azerbaijan intends to create terror and unbearable conditions of life for the population of Artsakh. These events are not isolated events. They are, instead, being committed within a larger genocidal pattern against Armenia and Armenians by the Azerbaijani regime. Separating Artsakh from Armenia and isolating and terrorizing ethnic Armenians residing in Artsakh are both methods of implementing further genocidal policies in the region, end quote. The United States government has condemned the blockade and has called upon Azerbaijan and Russia to restore access immediately. Canada, France, and other European governments have also followed suit. However, these statements have not been accompanied by specific action to demonstrate intolerance of the unacceptable situation in Artsakh and to assert the gravity of the situation to the Azeri leadership. Just last week, the Armenian National Committee of America held advocacy days in Washington, D.C., where Armenian Americans from the Eastern U.S. met with over 100 members of Congress and staff to urge the House to introduce a resolution to stop all U.S. aid to Azerbaijan and force the Azeri government to stop the blockade. This effort has resulted in over 60 original co-sponsors for the House resolution that we hope will be introduced in the House. Armenian Americans are dismayed at the anemic efforts of the U.S. government to exert pressure on the Azeri government to avert genocide, something Dr. Rubin has spoken unequivocally about. His lecture tonight, titled Remedying U.S. Policy in the Caucasus After the Lachin Blockade, will touch upon Azerbaijan's blockade of the Vazrik Corridor and its efforts to starve Artsakh's population into submission. These actions should be a wake-up call for Washington, D.C., as Azerbaijan's actions suggest President Ilham Aliyev's disrespect for U.S. diplomacy and the ineffectiveness of State Department strategy. As crises, both military and humanitarian, accelerate in the South Caucasus, what might the White House, State Department, and Congress do to ensure U.S. interests and Armenian human rights are paramount in American foreign policy in the region? With that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Michael Rubin. A former Pentagon official, Dr. Rubin has lived in post-revolution Iran, Yemen, and both pre- and post-war Iraq. He also spent time with the Taliban before 9/11. For more than a decade, he taught classes at sea about the Horn of Africa and Middle East conflicts, culture, and terrorism to deployed U.S. Navy and Marine units. Dr. Rubin is the author, co-author, and co-editor of several books exploring diplomacy, Iranian history, Arab culture, Kurdish studies, and Shiite politics, including 7 Pillars, What Really Causes Instability in the Middle East, Kurdistan Rising, Dancing with the Devil, The Perils of Engaging Rogue Regimes, and Eternal Iran, Continuity and Chaos. Most recently, he published a piece titled, "As Genocide Looms Against Armenians, Credibility Requires Action, Not Empty Rhetoric," outlining the response of the US government to the looming genocide in Artsakh. Dr. Rubin holds a PhD and an MA in history from Yale University, where he also obtained a bachelor's degree in biology. Welcome, Dr. Rubin, and thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me, Vazrik. I come to this with as much frustration as everyone in the audience at the ineffectiveness of US policy. Obviously, I'm not Armenian. I'm not an Armenian activist. I think of myself more as a national security analyst. And therefore, when I look at what is happening right now with regard to Artsakh, what's happening in the South Caucasus, it doesn't just frustrate me on the humanitarian level. What really frustrates me is the precedent which the United States is allowing to be set. What happens in Nagorno-Karabakh, what happens in the South Caucasus doesn't stay in the South Caucasus in this case. I look back at historic precedents. I mean, of course, one of the biggest problems, and this would be the talking point of the State Department in any one-on-one conversation, is just the difficulty of providing relief to the Armenian community in Artsakh, simply because Artsakh is landlocked. But again, precedents, Berlin, and of course the Berlin crisis. Why was President Harry S. Truman so intent on providing relief into Berlin when it was surrounded and when its oppressors wanted to take it over? The reason was not simply because of the civilians and the human rights of those living in West Berlin. It was more because of the precedent. If the Soviet bloc, if the East Bloc was able to take over Berlin, was able to basically snuff out that oasis of freedom, then where else might they decide to make a move if they believe that the United States wasn't serious in protecting people? Why was George H.W. Bush, the elder President Bush, so intent on not negotiating with regard to the fate of Kuwait in 1990? If you recall, there was some discussion at the time that maybe once Iraq, Saddam Hussein had invaded Kuwait, that this could be a subject for negotiation. Colin Powell, for example, had said that perhaps we shouldn't rush into a military conflict. But in this case, George H.W. Bush realized, and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom famously said, "Don't go wobbly on me now, George." The precedent that would set if you allowed what in modern political science jargon has been called salami slicing, where you let an aggressor take off a bite by bite by bite until suddenly your population is extinguished. I bring up the Kuwait situation for another reason. The world ignored, the State Department ignored the rhetoric of Saddam Hussein when he started referring to Kuwait as the 19th province of Iraq, as he started denying its claim to sovereignty, its claim to statehood, its claim to legitimacy. And what transpired was that Saddam Hussein wasn't simply engaging in Arab rhetorical flourish, as the former ambassador April Glaspie said at the time. Rather, he was deadly serious. And so we need to look at the same situation when it comes to Ilham Aliyev and making claims and actually pushing into sovereign Armenian territory at this point. We're not just talking about Artsakh, we're talking about a much broader problem, a problem in which there is eliminationist rhetoric. And so there's every reason to believe that if there's any compromise with regard to the Lachin Corridor, that this won't be the beginning of the end, this will be the end of the beginning, because the next bite, which Ilham Aliyev wants to chew off, would be within Armenia proper. Now, some people would say that he's just trying to distract his own public from the sorrowful economic state of Azerbaijan. But then again, this was the same situation which Saddam Hussein was in vis-a-vis Kuwait. He was deeply in debt. He had oil, but the corruption was just so extreme. His own family lived in palaces, but people were getting restless. We don't want to go down that situation before. History doesn't necessarily repeat, but it informs, and it's informing with a huge flashing strobe light at this point in time, screaming danger, danger, danger. Now, one of the other reasons why I worry about precedent isn't just in terms of great power competition or whatever else us sometimes in Washington, D.C. like to talk about to separate ourselves from the morality of the situation. The fact of the matter is we also have a precedent in which if Azerbaijan is allowed to get away with the slaughter of Armenians, with the starvation of men, women, and children, with the eradication of cultural heritage, then what message does this send to the rest of the world? What it does is it sends a message that it's open season on minorities. Some people, I mean, Ilham Aliyev and even some within the State Department will say, well, look, Artsakh technically, Nagorno-Karabakh technically is Azerbaijani. Therefore, international law is on Azerbaijan's side. You know, I can argue against that in a moment. Let me put that aside. But if we were to take that as fact, if this is how Ilham Aliyev treats those whom he considers to be Azerbaijani citizens, then it's all the more reason to treat Ilham Aliyev just like we treated Slobodan Milosevic or others who were intent on waging genocide against their own citizens. The fact of the matter is, whether the international legal question about whether this is Armenian territory or Azerbaijani territory, that's a distraction. What Ilham Aliyev is doing right now is no different than what Slobodan Milosevic did in the Balkans. And for the very same reasons, Ilham Aliyev deserves to be in The Hague. Now, the big elephant in the room, of course, is Section 907. When you ask the question, what is it that the United States can do? Every single hearing in Congress, the Armenian caucus is large and growing. Every single hearing in which the State Department is present, there should be a question about why legally there is a waiver to Section 907. Every State Department briefing, friendly journalists should be planted who will ask the question to the State Department spokesman to ask for an explanation as to why both the letter of the law and the spirit of the law are currently being violated. Again, this isn't just an Armenian issue. What Tony Blinken is doing, and to be fair, what Mike Pompeo did in the past and others in Republican administrations, is an affront to Congress. To the letter of the law, Congress passed the waiver with certain conditions for a reason, and to allow those conditions to be ignored is inexcusable. Now, I work, of course, on many different issues, and I don't simply focus on Armenia and Azerbaijan and the South Caucasus. So I want to bring in some comparative analysis as well. When I talk to the Indians, or for that matter, the Pakistanis, both are insistent, especially the Indians, the world's largest democracy, whatever problems it might have, that there should be no linkage in American diplomacy between India and Pakistan. India is the world's largest democracy. Pakistan is quickly on its way to being a failed state, and it's a Chinese proxy. Therefore, you seldom see the Secretary of State fly from Delhi to Islamabad. For diplomatic reasons, to emphasize the fact that there's no linkage, you will often have the Secretary of State, or for that matter, the Director of Central Intelligence, fly to an intermediate country first, not just as a rest stop, but to do real business, to show that these two countries aren't inextricably linked. We need to start doing the same thing with regard to Armenia and Azerbaijan. Whatever Armenia was a decade ago, it's far different now. Whatever problems people may have with the current government in Armenia, it's much more democratic than it was just a decade ago. It's time to start treating Armenia as a democracy and treat Azerbaijan as a failing dictatorship, much frankly, the same way in which we would treat a country like Turkey, Turkmenistan, or Burma, for that matter, Myanmar. We need to start recognizing that Armenia belongs in a different class of nations than its neighbors, and we shouldn't condemn it based on geography, to always suggest that whenever there is anything done to remedy historical justice in Armenia, it has to be partnered with some sort of linkage to Azerbaijan and some sort of olive branch to Azerbaijan. When it comes to Armenian genocide, for example, it's the right thing to do to recognize it. It has nothing to do with giving Azerbaijan a waiver to Section 907. It's all the more ironic that once you do give that waiver, it simply makes genocide version 2.0 all the more likely. Now, again, we go back to the problem of bureaucracy within the State Department. If the United States considers Nagorno-Karabakh to be part of Azerbaijan, pending the outcome of any sort of diplomatic process, let's put aside the fact that in 1991, at the declaration of re-independence of Azerbaijan, they declared their independence based on pre-Soviet geography rather than post-Soviet geography, and therefore technically and legally, they were ceding, perhaps by mistake, but nonetheless, Nagorno-Karabakh to Armenian sovereignty. Let's put that aside for a second. If the State Department wants to say that Nagorno-Karabakh is Azerbaijani by the technicality of law, then where the hell are the U.S. Embassy? Where the hell is the U.S. Embassy in Baku? We don't need to send diplomats just from the U.S. Embassy in Yerevan. If they can't get to Lachin, well, then certainly the diplomats from Baku do, because the diplomats from Baku, the American diplomats from Baku, they serve the United States. They don't serve the government of Azerbaijan. You guys are probably familiar with the famous anecdote about former Secretary of State George Shultz. Whenever he would appoint a new ambassador, a new American ambassador, he would bring him up to his office on the 7th floor. He had a big globe in his office, and he'd ask them to point to their country. And God forbid if they didn't point to the United States. It's important that the State Department, at the very top, Tony Blinken, order diplomats in Baku to be a permanent presence in Lachin. They can do it on rotation. They may not be comfortable, but they don't need to spend their time and their salaries from the American taxpayer strolling along the Corniche in Baku, shopping at Bulgari, and having coffee in fancy tea shops. They need to go where the action is, because frankly, genocide doesn't occur when there's a light shining upon it. It occurs best in the dark. Our diplomats need to be a light. Likewise, when it comes to the Minsk group, look, I have nothing against any of the American representatives to the Minsk group diplomacy. I knew Andrew Schofer personally when I was his intern back in 1994 in Bahrain. I haven't known Phil Rieker or the new gentleman, but with the exception of Phil Rieker, we haven't been appointing an ambassadorial level representative. Now, when the French and the Russians appoint an ambassadorial level representative, what this does is send the signal that the United States is not serious with regard to this issue. When Joe Biden came into the White House, to Joe Biden's credit, he was very engaged in the ongoing genocide in Tigray in Ethiopia. So what did he do? Initially, he sent Senator Chris Coons, one of his best friends, a person whom people say acts like a shadow Secretary of State, in order to be the unofficial special envoy. Instead of simply having an envoy from the State Department, why not have someone who the Joe Biden is clearly a friend with, who clearly has that level of communication? Why not have someone be dual-hatted? Unofficially, it could be someone like Senator Coons. It could be a senator. Or within the State Department, at the very least, it has to be an ambassador, but why not have it be an assistant secretary of state? And it's not like the Minsk group meets all that often. And certainly if Azerbaijan wants to reject the presence of an assistant secretary of state, well, then the United States needs to retaliate in kind. And there's no reason why, for example, Azerbaijan needs to have a fully operational embassy in the United States if it's not going to respect the United States or engage in good faith diplomacy. Now, one thing that Andy Zemenitis of the Hellenic American Leadership Council has written in the Greek newspapers, but it applies just as much with regard to the Armenia issue, is the bureaucracy, again, of the State Department. Why is the Turkey desk so disproportionately large? Yes, you have a consulate in Adana, you have a consulate in Istanbul, and you have an embassy in Ankara. But when you have more than twice as many, maybe 3 times as many people serving on the Turkish desk, as you do with regard to Greece, as you do with regard to Cyprus, as you do with regard to Armenia, then that is necessarily distortive, especially given the consensus-based nature of State Department policymaking. And of course, the consensus-based nature of State Department policymaking is also at fault. The analogy I would make here is when you have a hornet's nest, you have 2 good options. One is to get rid of the hornet's nest. The other one is to leave it alone. But if you always have to compromise and come down right in the middle, and you sit underneath that hornet's nest, lightly tapping it with the stick, that's the worst possible outcome. Now, moving on to the international community, and then we will finish, and I'll turn to questions and answers. You know, sanctioning can be very difficult, although it's certainly possible. And of course, it's much more possible with Magnitsky Act, global Magnitsky Act sanctions with regard to Azerbaijan. We've already started doing this. It can be done on a much greater scale. But when I deal, for example, with Iran, when I'm talking to European businessmen or East Asian businessmen who come to see me, I have no involvement in business. I take no money from any foreign state or commercial enterprise. But what they're concerned about is what the United States might do next. When you actually peel back the layers of their concern, they're concerned about the reputational risk to their companies and to their governments. And there's no reason why Congress can't use the bully pulpit to start asking very tough questions with regard to British Petroleum, with regard to why the United Kingdom at the UN Security Council seems to side disproportionately with a state like Russia when it comes to resolutions involving the human rights in the South Caucasus. Why is it? I mean, is it simply oil doing the talking for the British? Now, whenever you talk to a British diplomat, especially those who are engaged in Azerbaijan, you can tell by their eyes and you can tell by unofficial conversation that they are deeply uncomfortable. They start squirming in their seats because they know that the argument and the truth is not on their side. Why not make these arguments more public in a dispassionate way, in a way that's not easily dismissed simply as the word of an activist, but something much more chilling to them, to have a dispassionate criticism enter the mainstream in the British press, for example? Why is it that, let me shift more to other tactics. And I'm sorry, one of the issues with not doing death by PowerPoint, because I've always considered PowerPoint to be the work of Satan, is sometimes I'll lose my train of thought a little bit. But going back to what I said at the beginning, with regard to the Berlin airlift, you know, Stepanakert has a heliport. And that heliport was once in use back more than a decade ago. Now, it's not anymore, simply because people, I mean, even before the 2020 war, simply because people were afraid of what Azerbaijan might do. If the United States were to send an assistant secretary in on a helicopter, or an assistant secretary of defense to the Stepanakert air heliport in order to survey it, I don't think that the Azerbaijanis, I don't think that the Turks are going to try to shoot it down any more than the Soviets or the East Germans were going to try to shoot down the planes providing relief to the US during the Berlin airlift. So the fact of the matter is, there's no reason why we can't not only pre-stage humanitarian relief inside Armenia, but why we can't shuttle it for the most needed into Artsakh itself. Frankly, Azerbaijan and Aliyev, he's the Sultan that wore no clothes. We need to call his bluff. Two last points I would make. One is there's a temptation when you're an Armenian organization, without trying to be condescending, to look at everything through the lens of the Armenian issues. But the fact of the matter is, what we see in Azerbaijan is also linked to what we see in Turkey. And when we look at Turkey, when we look at Azerbaijan, when we look at the fact that Syrian jihadists came to fight on behalf of Azerbaijan in 2020, what we see is a host of people who are victimized by the same sort of jihadism, by the same threats of genocide. And therefore, it's essential to recognize that as organized as the ANCA is, as organized as other Armenian groups are, as active as Armenia's friends in Congress are, that there's also a Greek lobby, a Kurdish lobby. There are many very vocal Tigrayan activists and others, all of whom suffer from Turkish drones, all of whom suffer from Turkish threats of genocide, all of whom, in an almost rotational basis, seem to be victims of Erdogan's populism, if not Aliyev's populism himself. And so it's possible to show Congress and to show the State Department that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. The last suggestion I would have is I would urge everyone to take a look at a website called camera.org. It's the Committee for Accuracy in Middle East Reporting. I forget the exact acronym, but it's, the exact name, but it's camera.org. And it, whatever your opinion is on Israeli-Palestinian issues, it doesn't matter. What Camera should be is a model. What they do is they look at inaccuracies in reporting with regard to the Middle East very dispassionately. They correct those inaccuracies, and the metric by which they judge their success is the number of corrections which they force in the mainstream press. Now, whenever anyone talks about eco-activists, of course, this needs to be in quotations because Armenian press has already done analysis to show that the eco-activists, especially in a country with no civil society, are really just Azerbaijani military plants, Aliyev's troll army, and so forth. And this needs to be pointed out whenever anyone brings up the issue, the talking point, the propaganda that these are eco-activists. And on any number of other issues with regard to whether Nagorno-Karabakh, Artsakh is Armenian or not, regarding what happened to the Armenian community, to the Jolfa cemetery in Nakhichevan. The fact of the matter is there needs to be a repository in which not only can you force corrections, but it then becomes an education for some of the toughest issues within this debate. At any rate, let me conclude there. I hope I've been provocative enough for your time, and I look forward to your questions, and I'll say quite openly, be as open as possible, and I'll be taking notes because it might also inspire me for some new themes in my own writing. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rubin, for all your insight. For all the guests, please chat your questions. We already have collected some, and we're grouping them so that we can ask them efficiently to make the best use of Dr. Rubin's time. So Dr. Rubin, one of the first questions that came in is, as you noted in your lecture, the salami slicing approach is in full view with Mr. Aliyev. It's clear that he's not content with Artsakh alone, as he has plans for Armenia proper. Also, just a week or so ago, Mr. Mahmudov, the director of the Institute of History of Azerbaijan, has claimed Eastern Georgia as Azeri lands. So the question is, how far does he need to go before the world reacts to him? Europe is unreliable given their penchant for Azeri gas, so all eyes are on the US, and the US cannot go wobbly now. How do we get this message across?
Okay, well, I mean, just being a realist, the problem you face, of course, is that this situation is being overshadowed by Ukraine. And Aliyev is very smart. Aliyev is very tactical. It's not a coincidence, I don't believe, that what we saw in September 2020 to November 2020 coincided with the time when the United States was at its most distracted with our own election campaign. Dictatorships are very good at playing the American political calendar. So what I would argue is this is why there's a role for Congress to raise the volume. You know, the State Department tries to always do everything quietly. They try not to rock the boat. They try to maintain relations, positive relations with everyone. And sometimes they're so busy tree counting, they lose sight of the forest. Now, one other issue, and this is where the Greeks come into play, the Cypriots and others. Europe, in theory, wants to be reliant on Azeri gas, simply to bypass Russia. But what really is Azeri gas? The fact of the matter is, Azerbaijan has not been able to fulfill its contracts, and so it's been actively importing gas, in effect, helping Vladimir Putin launder. This is why the East Med pipeline is so crucial, a pipeline that will bypass Azerbaijan and bypass Turkey and get gas directly from democracies in the Eastern Mediterranean to the European market where it's most needed. The fact that the State Department, Amos Hochstein, has come out against this is shameful. And again, it shows that the State Department is incapable of seeing the big picture. One final point on this issue, however, while the State Department is in charge of carrying out policy, it's not as much in charge of making policy as some people assume. That role defaults to Congress. And this is why it's so important, and the activities of the ANCA, and I'm not going to take sides in the Armenian diaspora, the Armenian Assembly of America as well, why their activities on the Hill are so important, because it's the Congress which can hold Tony Blinken to account, that can hold against his own worst judgments. That's what we need to do at this point in time.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. A second question that's come up is, why do you feel the State Department is so intent on protecting Turkey, given the fact that Turkey is not really a true ally to the US? Why would you say that this is?
Okay, there's a few reasons. First of all, number one is wishful thinking. We tend to want to calibrate our diplomacy to the way we wish Turkey would be, or arguably the way it was once upon a time. And I know that Armenians may disagree with that, but there have been peaks and valleys in terms of the Turkish relationship with Armenia as well. So there's a wishful thinking as to calibrating it to where Turkey has been rather than what Turkey is right now. There's also this falsity that Turkey is simply too important to lose. How many times have we heard in internal debates in Congress or in the Pentagon or in NATO that Turkey has the second most largest number of troops in NATO after the United States? But as one military planner was telling me recently, that statistic is completely meaningless. I was talking to this military planner who had been involved, and again, it doesn't matter what your perspective is with regard to our intervention in Libya. The fact of the matter is, when NATO decided to become involved in Libya, what you do is you have a meeting in Brussels with officials from all different countries, and they determine, they tell you how much they are going to contribute to that mission. So it doesn't matter if you have 1 million troops under arms, if you're only willing to contribute 100. And these aren't the real numbers in this case, to a particular mission. The fact of the matter is, Turkey, the size of Turkey's army is completely irrelevant if it's not willing to participate productively in NATO. So it's time to end that wishful thinking. There's also a great deal of wishful thinking with regard to even if we realize how bad Turkey has become. Some of you may know that joke about one of these Turkish political prisoners goes into the prison library with a whole list of books. And he asked the prison librarian for some of these books to pass his time. And the prison librarian apologizes profusely and says, "I'm so sorry, we don't have any of these books. We only have the authors." The fact of the matter is, Turkey has become such an oppressive state, but could it go back to the status quo ante? Could it go back to the period of time before Erdoganism? Well, then you have a problem. Because if you're just doing a back of napkin calculation, more than 30 million Turkish school children have gone through the education system since Erdogan came into power 20 years ago. The entirety of the Turkish military has been reshaped in Erdogan's image. The same holds true for the bureaucracy. So even if Erdogan were to disappear tomorrow, we'd still be facing the legacy of Erdogan for a generation or more to come. It's a lot easier to incite a population than it is to eliminate that incitement. And unfortunately, the State Department remains blinded by its own biases, and that impacts our policy, the moral clarity of our policy to the region.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. As a follow-up related to this topic of Turkey, one guest asked, so Aliyev is in full belligerent mode with complete impunity, and it's backed and emboldened by, as you mentioned, Erdogan and Ankara. Why is the civilized world tolerating this? And more specifically, why is NATO tolerating Turkey pushing the Western world around with the ease as it's doing now, to the point of forcing President Biden to sign off on the F-16 deal to appease him?
It's a great question, and I mean, it simply expresses a great deal of the frustration. I mean, certainly when I talk to people from countries like Cyprus, and the same thing perhaps would be true of Armenia, what a common frustration within those countries by officials of those countries is whenever NATO or whenever Europe wants to come to some sort of even unrelated agreement with regard to Turkey, that they're too willing to sacrifice up smaller countries, unrelated countries, as concessions to Turkey. This is a mindset which we need to change within NATO. Unfortunately, the Europeans, I mean, NATO is a consensus-driven organization. We see too many within Europe. I mean, we see Turkey very effectively playing European states off each other. We also see too many Europeans having the mindset that perhaps just a little bit more compromise and Turkey will come around. We've got to stop that mindset as well. What we see consistently, we saw this with Pastor Andrew Brunson, is that however robust, I'm trying to think of the right word, whatever the vitriol of Erdogan, however strong his rhetoric is, his bark really is worse than his bite. We saw this with Pastor Andrew Brunson. Just a few, I mean, slapping a few steel tariffs on Turkey created a situation where Erdogan was compelled to release the imprisoned American pastor. Or if we want to go back to the Mavi Marmara situation, the flotilla that was transiting to Gaza, Israel went to stop the flotilla, killing nine or 10 Turks in the process, or 9 Turks and 1 Turkish American, I forget the exact numbers. Erdogan broke relations with Israel and said he needed an apology, he needed compensation, and he needed a lifting of the embargo on Gaza. Israel gave a half-hearted apology. There was some token compensation, and Israel refused to lift the embargo on Turkey. And as soon as the limelight on Gaza, as soon as the limelight moved on, Erdogan stepped back. What we need to understand is if you're willing to stand up to Erdogan, he has a history of backing down. He's the typical schoolyard bully who's afraid of confrontation. And this, by the way, is certainly a talking point that should be made within Congress to make sure that before every hearing, every representative has a list of times that Erdogan has backed down to show them, to show Congress what a weak man Erdogan really is.
Well said. One question, Dr. Rubin says, I understand the precedent argument you posed, but the question is, if US interest is to remove Russia from the Caucasus, and if that is the case, then the current inaction is forcing Armenia and Armenians more into Russian hands, as it still stands as the only option for military security. This is the inconsistency. There is inconsistency here, unless the objective of US interest is to have a higher level of Russian role in Artsakh. What do you say to this?
Okay. It's a great question, and this is one of the issues certainly within conversations in the Pentagon that comes up with regard to the Russian presence in Gyumri, for example, which is a shell of what it was many years ago, but regardless. The fact of the matter is the United States has traditionally been afraid of providing certain technologies to Armenia for fear that those technologies would fall into Russian hands. The analogy I would make here is during the Cold War, after Gamal Abdel Nasser had his heart attack, and in effect, you had regime change in Egypt. You switched from Nasser to Sadat, just like you've had in a different way a regime change in Armenia with regard to the 2018 Maidan revolution. Instead of the State Department simply saying, hey, look, Egypt is a Soviet client, therefore we're going to completely ignore it. What the Nixon administration did, and then Ford, and then Carter, was to, instead of dismissing Egypt as a Russian client, we worked to peel them away from the Russian orbit. And what I would argue, and this is what I would argue to those, for example, like my colleague over at the Hudson Institute, Michael Duran, who constantly as a mantra is saying that Armenia is a Russian puppet. What I would argue to him is that, even though we haven't had a chance to have this argument directly, is that, look, you wrote a book about Eisenhower, you wrote a book about the Cold War in the Middle East. The fact of the matter is we should be doing that Egypt strategy, peeling Armenia away. But you know what? Armenia's positions Armenia as well. The fact of the matter is the four countries with the largest Armenian diaspora, is of course Russia, the United States, Iran, and the United Kingdom. And the order of that might be wrong, but that's not the point. The point is that Armenia has a potential to sort of be a diplomatic Switzerland of the region, a place where people can talk where they can't otherwise talk. The Americans with the Russians, the Americans with the Iranians, the Russians with the Iranians, and hopefully one day too the Turks, if we actually ever have a responsible state in Turkey, a government that lifts its blockade of Armenia, which in my mind is the in the modern era, in the 21st century, is the original sin. I'm not talking about the genocide here. I'm talking in our immediate lifetime of the post-independence period. So, it's a problem, but it's a problem. The Russian presence is a problem. It's a problem that's not insurmountable. It's a problem that needs some creativity to address. But you know what? There's precedents there that show that we can address it. And I would just, whenever anyone shoots this talking point at me, I would say, do you think it's a bad thing that we flipped Egypt during the Cold War? It took effort, but you can't achieve the results if you don't start trying.
Very interesting. One question that's come up is that democracy, as you mentioned, is fundamental, yet one needs a country to run it democratically. The current situation in Armenia is moving it towards the precipice of loss of statehood, thereby making the democratic state a moot point. How would you address this?
Okay, I'm actually going to punt this question. And the reason I'm going to punt on this question is while I recognize what the questioner is asking, and certainly I'm afraid that, for example, if Armenia feels that it is facing looming genocide, that people may even take Russian passports for protection. But what I don't want to get into is a discussion. My own personal red line is I don't want to get into a discussion of internal Armenian politics. Because again, I'm less an Armenia activist. I'm not Armenian, of course. And I try not to interfere in the domestic side of things. I approach it through an American national security lens. And what I would argue is it behooves the United States to show that that we will stand by democracies, that we will protect democracies, so that they don't have to take an undemocratic turn. And if we want to look at the broader picture, during the first Nagorno-Karabakh war, Azerbaijan was actually at that time experimenting with democracy, or at least a little bit more democracy than it had once Haidar Aliyev took over, and then, of course, his son. And they lost territory. Georgia in 2008 had its Rose Revolution, and then Russia invaded Abkhazia and South Ossetia. Armenia had its Maidan Revolution. It turned much more democratic, and then it lost Nagorno-Karabakh. I'm afraid the Russians are playing a game here where they are trying to signal to everyone in not only the South Caucasus, but much further, if you embrace democracy, you are going to lose territory. And it behooves the United States to recognize that big picture and put the brakes on. And there are ways to do that. There are tripwires that the United States could have in place in order to ensure that Armenia's sovereignty is ultimately respected.
Thank you for that very fascinating point, Dr. Rubin. Another question that's come up is the both sideism arguments employed by the international community are becoming nauseating at this point. How would one approach, I know you touched on it a bit earlier, but how would one approach this dilemma to clearly make the point that the perpetrator and the victim are not equal participants in this equation?
I mean, basically, you just need to call this out whenever you hear this. And I've certainly seen ANCA when I look at the Twitter feed and the Armenian Assembly of America. Again, I'm not going to choose sides in the various Armenian diaspora groups. Call this out effectively. The fact of the matter is that what we're seeing right now in Artsakh with regard to the blockade along the Lachin Corridor is a victimizer and a victim. And it's time, whenever the State Department spokesman or whenever Tony Blinken falls into their boilerplate, mindless rhetoric, to basically call that out and embarrass them. To embarrass them politely, to maintain the relationship, but to convince them nonetheless of how ridiculous the position is. And you know what? Even though they say they don't, I'm sure they read the press about themselves. I'm sure they read some of the tweets, especially from groups like ANCA. Congress could certainly send letters asking on what basis the State Department spokesman has engaged in this both-siderism. Does the State Department spokesman, and is it the position of the State Department to believe that the children in Artsakh are as much at fault as the Azeri army is? And it's a question which the State Department is going to have a tough time answering, and they're going to be much more careful about their rhetoric moving forward if they are pressed about this in Congress and publicly.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin.
I mean, and if I may, the frustration is the State Department, again, is very fond of tree counting, very, very poor at seeing the forest. And the frustration, and I get the frustration, is people are literally starving now. And we're almost 2 months into this blockade. And it's completely inexcusable. I mean, frankly, the ultimate irony, which I would like to see us engage, is if we airdrop supplies, airlifted supplies based with our forces at the Incirlik Air Base, to basically put a finger in Turkey's eye and to say, if you want to kick us out of the Incirlik Air Base, so be it. And there's other ways we could do it, but we need to show that, you know, the clock is ticking and we're not operating on Washington time. Real lives are at stake.
On that point, Dr. Rubin, then one question that came up was, what's preventing specifically Samantha Power from initiating these humanitarian airlifts to Artsakh? Is there a fear Azeris would shoot them down? Are they preoccupied with other things? You mentioned Ukraine earlier.
I mean, ultimately, when it comes to Samantha, I mean, this would be more of a military thing than a USAID thing, but Samantha Power has a cabinet level position, and she should be shamed into it. Too often, Samantha Power likes to virtue signal, but we need to, and there's nothing wrong with virtue signaling, but there needs to be substance behind that virtue signaling. And so her feet should be held to the fire to ensure that the end all and be all of policy isn't a statement, isn't a tweet, but actually some real action. And in this, I would ask her what USAID has done to coordinate with the State Department and with the Pentagon in order to get emergency supplies to the Stepanakert heliport in order to be able or to drop supplies to where they're most needed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for reiterating this point of the title of your talk as well, right? The idea of talk is one thing, but actual action is much more critical. Changing topic just a little bit, you mentioned a little bit before, one question that's come up is what you said about British diplomats going down to British petroleum. I guess the question wants you to elaborate a little bit more on this point. Does the BBC give outright bias to Azerbaijan when discussing Artsakh? Would you say that the BBC has lost all credibility in discussing the Caucasus? What's your perspective?
Okay. First of all, I'm sitting here outside of Washington, D.C., and so I don't often watch BBC. American news is depressing enough. I don't need to get it all the time. That said, there have been a couple examples in which the BBC took Azerbaijani money, and we've talked about Azerbaijani influence before. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about caviar diplomacy as well. But the BBC has taken money in what I would see as a conflict of its interests. And this is something in which the Armenian community in the United Kingdom should be much more active about, especially as there's a BBC governing board. What I would say is you don't necessarily want to burn bridges with the BBC and dismiss them out of hand, because if they're forced to correct in a way where they're still allowed to save face, then they are much more likely to be much more even-handed or even have moral clarity in the future. The problem is, however, that British Petroleum is the major, Azerbaijan is its major client, or BP, I guess they don't call it British Petroleum anymore. BP has one of its most lucrative gas fields in Azerbaijan. The British government has always wanted to promote this because BP lobbies them. And so the question is, if you're the Foreign Office, you have a cost and benefit sort of calculation. The benefit is billions of dollars in revenue coming in. The same thing is true with BP. If you raise the cost, and that cost would be in terms of reputation, of financing genocide, then ultimately both diplomats and some BP executives might think twice. At the very least, they might want to begin having a very hard conversation with regard to their meetings with Ilham Aliyev.
I see. Wrapping up, maybe one or two more questions. One question wanted you to speak just a little bit more on how you would evaluate the role of Russia and specifically the impact of the Ukrainian war on the situation in Artsakh now.
Look, unfortunately, last time I was in Artsakh was in November 2020, when the Russian peacekeepers were first coming in. We're obviously in a very different situation now.
Yes.
And in terms of morale, in terms of the potential for the Russians to deploy adequate manpower, the fact of the matter is Azerbaijan with Turkish backing is taking advantage of the fact that Russia isn't able to do the job of peacekeeping. The question I would have, and this would be a question for the Minsk group, is what is being done to ensure, perhaps, that there are other countries that don't border either Azerbaijan or Armenia, who could, that aren't Minsk group principles either, that could contribute peacekeeping forces to separate the two sides, or at least to monitor the two sides. Is there any substitution down the line with regard to Russia?
Understood. Then to wrap up, maybe one final question as a follow-up to the previous one or two. Would you say that we're simply watching a new version of the great game from the early 20th century now with regard to BP, British involvement in Caucasus and Russia? What would you say to this?
To some extent, yes, but we have a lot more players in the great game than we once did. It's not just Britain versus Russia. Certainly Turkey has become involved in this as well. some would say it's Turkey versus Russia. Others would say it's Iran versus Turkey. Too many people are playing this game. The Armenians are being victimized by this, and unfortunately, too often the United States is nowhere to be seen. One of the practices of American diplomacy, which most frustrates me, not just here but elsewhere as well, is that the Americans become so obsessed with having an even playing field, and this goes into some of the both siderism, that we ignore the fact that other more reactionary forces, whether they're Russian, whether they're Iranian, whether they're Turkish or Azeri, are actively picking sides and aiding those sides. So if our natural allies, the more democratic, the more progressive, the more liberal, they have absolutely no support. They are at a deficit if our attitude is that we have to be an even broker. This is why, in addition to real power politics, there is a role for moral clarity, because this notion of an even playing field doesn't exist. Whenever you hear the Americans talk about it, what we're really talking about is throwing Democrats under the bus.
Well said. Dr. Rubin, thank you very much for your insight.
Thanks.
In closing, we would like to revisit specifically the history of US support for Armenia at the turn of the 20th century, if we may. In the aftermath of the 1915 Armenian genocide, US ambassador to the Ottoman Empire was not alone in ringing the alarm bells and bearing witness to the atrocities, which he called, quote, the extermination of an entire race, end quote. Many other wartime US diplomats in the Ottoman Empire, such as Leslie Davis and Dr. Robert Usher, collected data and filled the US National Archives repositories, providing vivid descriptions of the atrocities in progress. From 1915 to 1920, pages of the New York Times and other American newspapers were filled with horror stories and public outrage. Prompted by public sentiment and moral outrage, the US Senate on February 9, 1916, adopted Concurrent Resolution 12, stating that the President of the United States be respectfully asked to designate a day on which the citizens of the country may give expression to their sympathy by contributing funds now being raised for the relief of the Armenians, who, at the time, were enduring disease and untold suffering. President Woodrow Wilson concurred and encouraged the formation of the Near East Relief Organization. Chartered by an act of Congress, the Near East Relief Organization managed to raise some $116 million over a 15-year period from 1915 to 1930 to aid the survivors of the Armenian genocide and other victims of World War I. This amounts today to a $2 billion raise. Some 132,000 Armenian orphans became foster children of American people. Surprisingly today, the US government that champions the causes of human rights, liberty, freedom, rule of law, and justice has, for geopolitical reasons, as we heard today, been less vocal in condemning the ongoing persecution of the Armenians of Artsakh. The ideals of our founding fathers have not changed. And as the former US ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, has articulated in her seminal work, America in the Age of Genocide, the US government has responsibility to act and responsibility to protect to end the cycle of genocides. Tonight, with a unified voice, we pledge to respectfully remind our representatives to urge the Congress to reclaim its legacy of standing up for the innocent and the oppressed, and as Dr. Rubin mentioned, for democracies, and to emphatically condemn the genocidal actions of the Azeri government in Artsakh.